Hi everyone, this is Rabbi Moshe Rothschild coming to you from the land of Israel. We're celebrating today Jerusalem Day, or Yom Yerushalayim. I've prepared this little presentation to explain to you a little bit the history of Jerusalem and what we are actually celebrating on this day. So in case you don't know who I am this handsome fellow down here on the left. And though this presentation is a little bit longer than some of my others, I hope you'll stick with me to the end, and I think you'll find that it is well worth it. The history of Jerusalem really begins, we can go back to King David. About 3,000 years ago, King David was a 30-year-old king, and for 7.5 years his capital was in the city of Hebron, or in English it's pronounced Hebron. And at the age of 37.5, King David moved the capital to this hill you see on the right here in this artistic rendition. This hill was controlled by the Jebusites. It was called Yevus, and King David captures this hill as reported in the Bible, and he makes this his capital city. This becomes known as the City of David, or Jerusalem. Now that David had moved the capital from Hebron to Jerusalem, he had another job in mind. As the Bible tells us in the book of Samuel, chapter 7, verse 2, the book of Shmuel, David said, "See, now that I'm living in a house of cedar while the ark of God dwells within the curtain." David was upset. How could it be that he lives in a big palace while the Ark of the Covenant was really in a very small building just surrounded by curtains? So David wanted to build what was called the Beit HaMikdash, or the Holy Temple. But God told David that he was not going to be able to build that. The book of Chronicles gives us the reason, because David had blood on his hands. David was a warrior, and even though he fought justified wars, nevertheless, the temple had to be built by a man of peace. David was promised, though, that his son Solomon was going to build the temple. So it was, as the book of Kings tells us, so Solomon built the temple and completed it. And here on the right is a picture of an artist's rendition of what the Temple of Solomon would have looked like. Solomon's temple remained standing for approximately 400 years until it was destroyed by the Babylonians and their king Nebuchadnezzar, or Nebuchadnezzar in Hebrew. And the Babylonians, after destroying the first temple, exiled many of the Jews to Babylon. The Psalm 137, Tehillim, recalls the feeling of the people after the destruction, as it says, "By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion." The exile to Babylon, though, was fairly short-lived, a historical blink of an eye. The Jewish people remained in exile for a total of 70 years. While they were in exile, the Babylonians were deposed by the Persians, and the Jewish people lived under the Persian Empire. If you remember the story of Purim, or the book of Esther, that whole story occurs during the exile. Cyrus, who was a Persian king, issued a declaration. And in that declaration, Cyrus allowed for the Jews to return and to begin rebuilding the Second Temple. This declaration is recorded, or at least part of it, in the book of Ezra, where it says, "Whoever is among you of his entire people, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and build the temple of Hashem, God of Israel. He is the God which is in Jerusalem." This declaration by Cyrus, the archaeologists actually found the declaration, and if you take a look at this stone here, and it's kind of hard to see, but all of this is the writing in the ancient Persian. This actually is the declaration of Cyrus, or in Hebrew it's called the Hatzarat Poresh. So they went back to Jerusalem, and the Bible reports that the temple, this is from the book of Ezra, says, "Then Zerubbabel, the son of Shaltiel, and Jeshua, the son of Yotzadak, arose and commenced to build the house of God, which is in Jerusalem, and with them were the prophets of God assisting them." So a man named Zerubbabel, the son of Shaltiel, came back to Jerusalem, and he began the construction of the second temple. That second temple was completed in the year 516. And that temple also stood for about 400 years, but towards the end of the second temple period, about the last 70 plus years, a man named King Herod reigned. King Herod is a bit of a controversial figure, but King Herod, one of the projects that he embarked upon was the renovation of the temple in Jerusalem. And Jewish teachings, the Talmud says, whoever has not seen Herod's building has not seen a beautiful building in his life. So Herod took the second temple and he renovated it. Herod is not the builder of the second temple, he is the renovator. And take a look at this as a rendering of what Herod's temple would have looked like. Here's the temple building here, and he constructed this enormous compound around it. This here, by the way, is the western wall. We only have a piece of it that's exposed today. And here, obviously, is the southern wall, the eastern wall, and the northern wall. And this here is the actual temple building. But Herod becomes associated with the temple, but it's important to remember that he's only a renovator. So that temple stands until the year 70. Now along came the Romans, and the Romans destroyed the second temple, and they destroyed Jerusalem. The Roman general who destroyed Jerusalem was a man named Titus, and the emperor, his name was Vespasian. Here on your left here, you take a look, this was a Roman marker, a pillar found near the temple, and it actually says here, if you look, you can see the E-S-P-A-S-I-A, and it actually says Vespasian there. And you see also the name of Titus and some of the other names of the people who were instrumental in the destruction of the temple by the Romans. Here you have an artist's rendition of the destruction. Here, this is from the Arch of Titus. The Arch of Titus was after the destruction of Jerusalem. They marched Jews back to Rome as slaves, and here you see a depiction of the menorah, right, or the candelabra that was in the temple, and a number of other items from the temple. You see what's called the chatzotzrot, or the trumpets, and this is actually what has led many people to believe that currently today in the Vatican, that hidden in the Vatican somewhere is the actual menorah from the temple. But we don't know that for certain. So this is what appears in the Arch of Titus. Remember, this is a victory arch that the Romans constructed nearly 2,000 years ago. Unfortunately, I say unfortunately, but I mean only for them, their victory was hollow and did not last long, as we will see shortly. Now, after the destruction of the temple, Jews went into exile. They went into diaspora. And the first of the rulers who ruled over Israel after the Jews were forcibly exiled were, of course, the Romans. And the Romans were in the land of Israel from the year 63 before the Common Era until the year 33 of the Common Era, meaning after the year 0. And then the Romans were transformed into what's called the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire was essentially the Roman Empire that turned Christian, and the center was moved to Byzantium, or in current-day Turkey. Now, the Byzantine Empire was then defeated by the Arabs in 633, and this is where we see the beginning of Islam, approximately 1,300 years ago, the newest of the world's three major religions, of course, Judaism being oldest, then Christianity, and then Islam. So you have the Arab period from 633 to 1099. After that, you then had the Crusaders who came and defeated the Arabs, and they controlled the land of Israel from 1099 until 1291. Along came the Mamelukes. The Mamelukes were Arabs. They came from Egypt, and they defeated the Crusaders, and they ruled in the land from 1291 to 1517. After them, the Mamelukes were defeated by the Ottomans. The Ottoman Empire in 1517, defeated the Mamelukes. The Mamelukes did not have gunpowder, and the Ottomans came along, introducing gunpowder to the region, and they defeated the Mamelukes. And they were here for about 400 years, till 1917, till the end of World War II, when the lands of the Ottoman Empire were divided between the French and the British got control of the land of Israel, and this was called the British Mandate. Right? And the land, of course, was called Palestine from the period of the Romans. The Romans renamed the land of Israel Palestine. They named it after the traditional enemy of the Jews from the Bible, called the Philistines. There were no people alive then called Palestinians or anything like that, but they called it Philistine because they wanted to not only destroy Jerusalem and the Jewish people and put them into exile, but they wanted to pour salt on the wounds by renaming the country after their traditional enemies. So the British Mandate ruled over Palestine from 1917 to 1918. And from 1917 to 1948. And it was actually before 1948 that the British decided that they were going to hand over Palestine to the United Nations in order for the United Nations to find a solution to the tensions between the Arabs who were living here and the Jews who were living here, to find a solution and try and somehow divide up the land in some sort of equitable fashion. There were a number of ideas put forward in the United Nations, but I'm not going to go into all of them. But the final one that was decided and voted in the United Nations, voted on November 29th, 1947, in the UN vote. It was actually called Proposition 181, to partition Palestine. In other words, what they decided to do is to divide up what was then called Palestine into two territories. Take a look at this map here. You have the yellow area here being the Arab state, and the orange color here being the Jewish state. The Jews accepted the Resolution 181, while the Arabs totally rejected it, which left Jerusalem up for grabs. Here, Jerusalem was meant to be an international city, but the entire map was rejected by the Arabs. And from November 29th until May 14, 1948, there was essentially civil war in the land. The Arab states from outside of the state of Israel did not yet attack, but the Arabs who were living within Israel were already at war with the Jews who were living here. So you can call that a civil war. And then on May 14th, 1948, David Ben-Gurion, take a look, he's in the center here, called it was quote-unquote a secret meeting on Friday, May 14th, 1948, in the city of Tel Aviv. This was the home of the first mayor of Tel Aviv. His name was Mayor Dizengoff, and he donated his home to become an art museum in Tel Aviv, and they used that art museum as the place that they were going to declare the new state. So on May 14th, 1948, the state was declared on Friday. Now, a little bit before the Shabbat set in. So again, November 29th, 1947, the UN gave permission to divide Palestine into a Jewish and an Arab state, and the Jewish people accepted that, and on May 14, 1948, they declared that actual state. Now, after May 14, 1948, the state of Israel was invaded. Now, the British, just before the war, left. In May of 1948, the British were leaving Palestine. They had already begun leaving already in November of 47, but I want to share with you an unbelievable story. As the British soldiers were leaving the old city, here's a picture on the left of British soldiers leaving the old city. On their way out, they stopped at the home of, I wouldn't call him the chief rabbi, but he was the senior rabbi in the old city. Here's a picture of him. His name was Rabbi Mordechai Weingarten. And as the British soldiers marched up in for their final march, as they exited Jerusalem, as they were leaving the old city, they came to the home of Rabbi Weingarten, and they knocked on his door. And Rabbi Weingarten came to the door, straightened his hat, dusted off his shirt, opened the door, and he saw the British soldiers standing there. Now, the head of the British soldiers, the leader of their garrison, came forward and took his hand and extended it to Rabbi Weingarten, and he said, even though perhaps we didn't always see eye to eye, I would like to leave here as friends. And he handed Rabbi Weingarten a rusty key. And that key, he said, was the key to the Zion Gate of Jerusalem. And Rabbi Weingarten started to weep, and he looked at the British soldier, and he said, for 2,000 years, the keys to Jerusalem have not been in our hands. I accept them in the name of my people. And he recited the blessing, Blessed art thou, O Lord our God, who has allowed me to remain alive and to experience this moment. So the Jewish people had come close to now coming full circle. The temple was destroyed in the year 70. The country had been occupied by nation after nation, people after people, and finally the keys to Jerusalem, to the old city, was handed back to Rabbi Weingarten. Now it wouldn't last long, because war ensued, and after 2 weeks, the old city fell to the Jordanians. And it remained that way for 19 years until 1967. And there were build up along the Syrian border, the Egyptian border, and the Jordanian border of troops ready to invade Israel, because once and for all, the Arabs who are on our borders decided they wanted to push Israel into the sea and to destroy the Jewish people. Take a look what was coming out of the radio in Egypt. Our basic objective will be the destruction of Israel. The Arab people want to fight. From Jordan, all of the Arab armies now surround Israel. The UAR, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Yemen, Lebanon, Algeria, Sudan, and Kuwait. And from Syria, our two brotherly countries have turned into one mobilized force. The withdrawal of the UN forces means make way our forces on their way to battle. Israel was surrounded, had thousands upon thousands of troops on all of our borders. And you had a pact, take a look here, signed between Jamal Abdel Nasser, who was the president of Egypt, and King Hussein here of Jordan, that they would both go to war together. And the troops of the Jordanian troops were actually put under the leadership of Nasser of Egypt. Here is a picture of the Syrian tank on the Golan Heights. Israel thought they would win, but they were afraid that there would be enormous casualties. The United States was not sure if Israel would win this war. Israel began already digging graves for the casualties that they expected. And Israel, in a surprise attack on June 5th, 1967, launched a preemptive strike against Egypt in the south. In a preemptive strike, Israel destroyed the entire Egyptian Air Force on the ground. Here is a photo taken of the Egyptian Air Force, or you see 3 planes here on the ground. And Israel essentially, in the first hour of the war, eliminated one front, because after they destroyed the Egyptian Air Force on the ground, they then rolled their tanks through the Sinai Desert and essentially they were basically involved in a mop-up job on the entire Egyptian front. Now, on the third day of the war, on June 7th, that is when Jordan entered the war, and it was the last 2 days of the war where Syria entered the war. I want to just jump to the end of the war for a second. Take a look at these maps here. This is how the map looked on June 4th, 1967. This area is the Sinai Desert, controlled by Egypt. This area here is Syria, where there were huge Syrian buildups, and here where I am running this red dot is what's called the Golan Heights. And this area here, this lighter kind of beigeish, brownish area, is what's known in the Bible as Judea and Samaria, or what the world calls the West Bank. So when we defeated Egypt in the south, look what happens to the Sinai. That all becomes now part of Israel. Right? This is where the border was beforehand. Compare the maps. Right? The entire Judea and Samaria now is redeemed and once again becomes part of Israel. And the Golan Heights here by the end of the war now is again redeemed and becomes part of Israel. So Israel has become 3 times the size of what it was before the war. It was an enormous victory in 6 short days. Now, the crowning jewel of the war, of course, was what happened in Jerusalem. Here you have a picture of the Israeli troops as they surrounded and were ready to enter the old city. And in the center of the picture here, without the helmet on, this is Matagor, who's in charge of the battle for Jerusalem. And here he is, he's giving a pep talk to the soldiers before they're going to enter the old city. And here you have the paratroopers entering the old city of Jerusalem. And finally, they captured the Western Wall. And you have the famous picture of the soldiers here at the Western Wall looking up. After 2,000 years, nearly 2,000 years, the Western Wall was in our hands once again. And here's a picture of Rabbi Goren, the rabbi of the army, holding a small Torah, and a soldier here blowing the shofar, reciting blessings. The emotions of the moment are indescribable. You have the General Moshe Dayan and Yitzhak Rabin and Uzi Narkis, the leaders of the military, entering to come to visit the Temple Mount. This was a moment that was literally, people thought the Mashiach, the Messiah, was about to arrive, as the Jewish people had once again reunited Jerusalem, and the Temple Mount was in our hands. Har Habayit biyadenu, the famous words uttered by Matagor as the Temple Mount was once again reunited and redeemed. Rothschild from Israel. We hope you've enjoyed the presentation. Remember, Jerusalem is the eternal capital of the Jewish people. Jerusalem is the light of the world, as they say in Hebrew, Yerushalayim, Ora Shel Olam. Have a great day. Enjoy the slides. Enjoy the music.
Yerushalayim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu.